So a little bit different than some of my other videos. So I want to talk about why people sometimes why 3D printing will not always take over all these uses for materials. I don't see it for the very high performance metal things for a very long time, even though there's a lot of hype. I'm going to talk about. I also think I'm not going to only talk about 3D printing, but I'm also going to talk about a seemingly totally different topic, metallurgy, and how sometimes in science and society we take something basic and we don't realize how complicated it is, and we really don't invest in these basic things enough into research. So metals, so even if a metal is made of the same material, it can have vastly different properties. You can have this almost the same material and have it be over 10 times harder by a metal depending on how you heat it up, work it with pressure, hit it, how you cool it down, repeat heating ups, and all this stuff about how you're making it. It can have its conductivity can vary by up to 40%. Its strength can be so many different, and all these other things like how well sound and vibrations travel through. There's a ton of different types of strength. There's strength if you compress something or squish it. There's strength if you pull it apart. There's strength if you just hit something quickly. There's strength for vibrations, all these different ones. And a big part of it has to do with something called the metal grains, or oftentimes, sometimes some people call it crystals, but more grains. And I have a picture of a bunch of them here. But basically, every metal has a bunch of small, little grains, except for metal glass, which I'll get to. With some metal glass, something called metal glass, not actually glass metals, but I'll get to that too. Has little grains, and they all fit together, like all these little pictures here. And these little grains give rise to totally different properties in metal. If you the metal, they tell you how force is transmitted. So like every time, how well these grains fit together, because some of them fit together a lot better than other ones, can tell you how well they can slide apart, or a whole material could just fall apart, or it can tell you how well one force can transmit to another force. It can tell you how to transmit it. And to give you an example of this, maybe is like if you build a thing out of Legos, or if you build a thing they fit together very well and the structure is very strong. If you build the same thing out of plastic bricks that are smooth, they don't fit together very well. And it's not rigid, it'll just fall apart or crumble a lot more easily. You could have ones where you have different grain, you could have other grain boundaries that other shapes, constructions, you can see that the different amount of strength is if you arrange straws in different patterns or build anything out of different patterns, it can give you totally different strengths. So hopefully you get that, but it's not only the strength, it's how it transmits the force. And then you can have bigger or smaller ones. Smaller ones can make the whole thing more flexible and fit stuff together better sometimes, but they can also have more likely have like imperfections that can lower overall strength. They can also have more places where cracks can form, because like at every boundary a crack could form, which will lower it. Big ones can have less places for cracks to form, but it might not be as tightly woven together and as rigid. You can sometimes have a mix of big and small can give you the best of both worlds, or stronger than either one alone, because the cracks have to keep changing direction. Because cracks usually run along these boundaries, so if there's many different ones that's going different directions, that's constantly changing direction, the whole material can become stronger. You can even have something called metal glasses where there are no crystal boundaries. And that's when you really heat up a material really fast, then you heat up it really fast, then cool it down really fast, that none of these crystals can form. And that can lead to cool materials that are some of the best at transmitting forces. They're not the strongest, but they're really good if you hit them, reflecting back the force at you. So if you drop a ball on them, the ball bounces up and down 20 times longer than a normal material. It's incredible. And there's a boasting about making like golf clubs out of it, but the problem with the golf clubs made out of it is there's actually a limit to how well you can make a golf club according to certain parameters, not to make them unfair. So what they did is they made a tiny bit of this material over material that's not as good to balance it out. So it ends up there's no advantage of these super expensive golf clubs. A gimmick right there. Theoretically, they could make you hit a golf ball a lot farther. Not 20 times farther, there's a limited amount of force, but less of the force will go into the golf club and more of it just into the ball. It also affects electronic properties, these basic boundaries, because every time if the bigger your grains are, or that if you have no grains at all, your electron can just move at it. Every time it hits a grain boundary, it acts like a boundary, and there's a little bit more of electrical impedance and slows down. Not a lot, but a little bit, and it adds up. So metal glass is a lot more conductive. Things with big grains are a lot more conductive and a lot more perfect. It can affect the magnetic properties, which are related to how well electrons can move through it, something too. It can affect how much it expands and absorbs, because if it has more imperfections and little things, there's actually more room for gaps for it to expand within itself and not expand outwards and make the material blow up bigger. A little more wiggle room. You can think about it. And other ways it pushes together. It can affect how heat deforms it, because it deforms differently at the boundaries than within the thing. And all these cool things. And this is just based on the grains having all the same chemical composition, but they don't. Because different things solidify when you heat up and cool down a metal. Different things solidify at different rates in the metal. Some things solidify a lot faster in the metal, some things slower, and some things also stick together better because they have more similar structures or they mesh together better, which means that one grain might have more iron and carbon, and one grain might have almost only, one grain might have, in the steel metals, it's often common that some grains have more carbon in them, and some grains have less carbon in them, and sometimes some grains have more of certain metals in steels, which can actually has a huge impact in strength. And in extreme examples, you can actually see, like Damascus steel, if you ever look at it, you can actually see sometimes different coloring and waving patterns just based on naturally. Oh yeah, and I forgot, it can also always can affect how light reflects and bounces off of it, because the smoother the surface, even on a micro scale, the more reflective it is, hugely. And just how it bounces off with the different alignments of stuff. So always amazing properties. And it's just getting by people heating it up and cooling it down so certain crystals form in certain ways. If you heat up something really hard and cool down really fast, what happens is you get small crystals on average, but some crystals form at different temperatures. So you can also set the rate that it heats up really fast, cools down really fast to form certain crystals. Then you heat up to melt certain crystals, or you do it different rates at different times, heat up in different patterns just to form different combinations. You can also put on the pressure, and when you pressurize stuff, you can fuse some of the crystals together, or you can cause some of the crystals boundary or the little imperfections just to disappear, because the presses in atoms wherever there's imperfections and fuses it together, which can actually make the material a lot harder, a lot stronger, and sometimes even more conductive, but also makes the whole material more dense and heavy because you've compacted it. And it's a very complicated way that there's a bunch of different ones, and there's pros and cons. And sometimes you can also just harden the surface or part of it by cooling part of the material fast in other parts and bend the material. The most famous example is that probably out there is katanas, where they cool down the surface, different parts of the blade at different rates. So the tip, the edge is a lot harder, but it's more brittle. And the back is more flexible to absorb energy. And it's the same material, they just cool it down at different rates in different parts of it. You can also do that, they also do it with gun barrels, actually, for some guns, that the inside is a lot softer than the outside, and you want the hard outside, because for the impact and smoothness, but hardness things, if they're thick, they crack more easily. It's not the same thing if it's thin, but thick stuff, hard things crack more easily, when soft things don't. And you can kind of see that with the squishy thing doesn't crack as much. But a squishy thing is likely to get deformed or turn up. But just putting a little hard thing over it can help a lot. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Now, where does this go on with designing materials with 3D printing? Well, with 3D printers, there's a huge problem that we take a metal, we deposit it, a little bit of it, and we melt it to form a structure. We melt it a little bit, either from a powder, that we have a bunch of little powders that we melt together, and they fuse and become one solid mass. We can take a little wire and we melt a little bit of the wire a little bit at a time. Another version is that we put the metal into like a plastic powder, that we take the plastic powder and we print it out with the plastic powder, or it's stuck in a plastic wire, the same as with other printing methods. Then we remove the plastic somehow by burning it off, dissolving it off. But all this doesn't give you the fine control over this hardening procedures that I've been talking about, or softening, or a bunch of other names that are more specific, because instead you're just kind of melting it haphazardly, and you might even melt the same thing repeatedly, because if you have two things next to each other, the heat might deform the crystal of something else nearby, or something like that. So what you end up is not this precise control, and you lose a lot of advantages of this precisely controlled metal. Now, there are ways around this to make these machines stronger, and 3D printed metals right now are not nearly as strong for the most part, unless you make it out of titanium. Then it gets really hard to make in the first place. But the way we can make it stronger is we make the material, then we do use one of these hardening procedures. But the problem with the hardening procedure is it might deform it in the hardening procedure itself. So it might have been better just to make it in the first place with one of these procedures. And it's controlled. So one common one is that you print a piece, you put it in a high pressure thing, and the pressure of the atmosphere presses it out in every direction equally. So it kind of, hopefully, so it deforms in the right way. But it might not deform it perfectly. But the idea is you want to pressurize it, everything, then you heat it up and cool it down in the right ways. It can solve the problem a little bit, but not perfect. But it adds an extra cost. That might be worth it. Also, there's a lot of extra cost, because if you're making any of these stuff out of a powder, you have to make the powder, then you have to remelt the powder, and you have to make the powder work perfectly and everything. So you have always cost of production. Then you have to move the tool in precise manners. So you also have the tool moving and tracking and everything, and that uses a lot of power, just constantly moving if you take it for every little piece and remelting it in a precise way. Then you have the hardening procedure again, which you haven't saved on it. So you lose a lot more power, a lot more time, because you have to make the powder and stuff like that to often make the most precise powder. Or the wire, which is less precise but still uses a lot. There are alternative methods. They're a little bit in between that have been used, such as instead you always have a piece of metal and you cut it out of the metal. If you cut out a piece of the metal, but this is only good for really flat pieces of metal. So if I have a flat pancake or something, I can just cut out. If my structure is a flat disc, I can just cut out a disc out of a big square metal piece of sheet. Now I can fuse that disc to another disc, so I don't have to use as much powder or anything. That is kind of something in between. There's other ways where we can use not all with 3D printed, but some with 3D printed. But my point basically is 3D printing has a lot more drawbacks when it comes to metals, and making metals a lot more complicated. And it's actually something really not well researched. There's almost no school in the US that really teaches metallurgy in university or college. It's seen as very much a trade thing or a trade job, which is really, really unfortunate because metals are everywhere, and just making a metal a little bit better when it's so ambiguous could lead to so much better technologies. Because imagine if you can make it more environmentally friendly by making it stronger, so you have to use less, or more environmentally ways of making it, or with metals are not as bad for the environment, or you can make stuff that's more conductive, could save a lot more electricity, or you could make more custom metals, because we have already a bunch of alloys, but different alloys, every alloy is not clearly one is better than the other one. They have neat uses that make them one or better. Even if people that know which one is better sometimes than the other time, they can make better choices for all sorts of things they appear in, which could make all sorts of products cheaper, more practical. But we really don't understand. There hasn't been a lot of basic research into metals and understanding metal properties or predicting them. It's all almost been by engineers and stuff for a specific product, designing it a little bit, or that people that know the lists or listen, look at it, very much company-based, but not just generally exploitative. And it's not done by, it's looked down upon by so-called serious academics, which I have a huge issue about. And not to say that it hasn't been done, but just a lot. Well, thank you very much for listening. I'm trying to reach 1,000 subscribers in about a year, which is a really hard goal. I had to recently take a lot of time off because of some issues. But I would really help if you could like and subscribe and share this with anyone you know. Try to get them to also like and subscribe, and leave a comment behind to promote my videos with any questions or anything you have about the topics, or any ideas for future topics or comments. Thank you very much. Goodbye.